Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to this session on platform economy. My name is Riikka Kämppi. I work for My Data Global as a media and public relations person, previously also a board member at My Data Global. This session, which is about to start, is very unique from any other session during this conference, because this one is about geopolitics, about impact of data on geopolitics and power relations. Before I introduce our fantastic speakers, I just quickly want to go through some of the practicalities. If you have any technical issues or problems, please use the chat here in Zoom. It's between participants and share screen button below our faces. But for the questions, if you have any questions for our speakers, it would be better to use Kiko. So if you open another window, you have there a place where you can put your questions so that at the end of the sessions, they will be replied to. And also it would be great if at the end of the session, you would share some of the highlights there in Kiko. But do not worry if you accidentally put your questions here in Zoom. We will do our best to pick them up from there so that they don't get lost. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce our guests, Molly Schwartz and Sangeet Paul Choudary. Sangeet is the author of two excellent books, Platform Revolution and Platform Scale. He's also the founder of Platform Thinking Labs. And I can't resist to do a little bit of advertising here because the masterclasses they're offering are so great. I really highly recommend, and good news for the My Data community members, a significant discount is available for you. You'll find more information about that on Slack, or you can send me or any other staff member a note, so we'll help you to find the info. Sangeet has advised several international institutions and governments, and of course the private sector as well. He has been selected as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum, just to name one example of his international recognition. I believe he's joining us today from Singapore late night, so good evening. Sangeet, very exciting to have you here.
Good evening.
And then we have Molly Schwartz, who is the Digital Media Fellow at Mother Jones, which is a progressive, great American magazine. She has been involved in the My Data community since the very beginning. So I'm fully confident that during the next 45 minutes, she will ask some super interesting questions from Sangeet to shed light on the impact of data on markets and on societies globally. And I think Molly's joining us from early morning in New York. I think it's Brooklyn where you are.
It is, yes.
So good morning to you, Molly. The floor is yours.
Good morning, and it's great to see everybody here. I see a lot of familiar names and some new ones, so thanks for joining us from wherever you are. And Sangeet, if it's cool with you, I'm just going to dive into some questions.
Let's do that.
So first, I'm going to group what we're talking about into three loose buckets. And as was mentioned, people can ask questions along the way. I'll try to kind of monitor the chat and leave a little bit of time at the end. The first bucket that I want to talk about is data economics, because in so many ways, data has totally revolutionized economies around the world. So first, to start with some basics, what makes data different from other kinds of major economic inputs? So things like labor or land, or a lot of people compare it to energy sources like oil. What makes data different?
Right. So a lot of these comparisons can only be stretched so far. So there is a lot of comparison to energy sources, as you mentioned, like oil. And one would expect that that's largely because the traditional economy used to run on oil and the new economy runs on data. And if you had to move, if you had to move physical logistics, it required oil, digital logistics, if you will, which is things as simple as how do you move the right car to the right person who's asking for it, is run using data to some extent, right? So there's a lot of different ways why one would think of data in those terms, but there's a few things that are fundamentally different about data, which are interesting to think about. The first is that data as an asset is actually closer to um, financial assets than it is to physical assets that we're talking about over here. So the reason I say that is because while data in itself has value, derivatives of data have even more interesting value. And data can be not just replicated, it can be recombined. And the same data, when recombined with many different other sources of data, can create entirely new value. And so the combinatorial and derivative value of data is not just additive or extractive as you would have it with physical assets. So if you have a physical assets, you can create derivatives. So you can go from natural oil all the way to petroleum and to other derivative products, but they are very extractive. There's only so many things that can be extracted out of it. And so it's finite. Data, on the other hand, once you start recombining it, can be moved towards any number of derivatives. And similarly, physical products are additive. They can be brought together to create larger systems. All of that is there. But data is recombinable in many different ways, where because of this and because of the fact that derivatives and recombinations of data can take on many different shapes, it allows companies that own this data to move easily between different industries and to cross industry boundaries much more easily, because the same data, when combined or converted into a new derivative, can inform an entirely new decision in another part of the economy. And these are the things that make data fundamentally different from any other physical asset as such, which all have relative limitations, as I just explained. Now, the other element of data economics that is interesting is that data is seemingly infinite, in the sense that there's a lot of statistics about how all the data ever generated till 2003, since the history of time, we're generating that amount of data every 2 days, and now maybe it's every 2 hours, and it's only accelerating. So data, unlike a lot of other physical resources which we have extracted over the last several years, or even trained labor for that instance, those things are finite, and data seemingly seems infinite. I mean, there are obviously limits to data, in the sense that if you extract too much data, the marginal value of data starts decreasing after a point. But the point remains that given, without any external constraint, there are possibly many different ways in which data can be extracted. And one of the key constraints that comes in the way of data extraction, there are actually two constraints, if you will. One is the interest of legacy systems. They want to prevent data from flowing easily. And so that's one negative constraint that comes in the way of data extraction, comes in the way of innovation in certain industries, which is why healthcare innovation, for instance, moves much slower than innovation in, say, the media industry, where data is much more easily extractable. But then the other force that comes and impacts data economics is regulation, because while the potential scope of extracting data is limitless, regulation can come in and create boundaries for where it should be extracted and where it should not be, and where it is concentrating power away from the producers of data, and where it's giving power back to them. So these are some of the issues that we need to think about when we start thinking of data economics.
I feel like this idea of it being additive and recombinable in different ways is something that people have talked about a lot in my data settings, just because there's so many things about the reuse of data that could add value to it. I do want to tag on to your comments about regulations. When people are talking about data regulations, interoperability is a concept that comes up a lot as a tool that could be used to kind of rein in some of these platform monopolies. I was wondering your thoughts on whether interoperability would threaten the current business model of platforms, and is that potentially a good thing?
Yeah, that is a multi-layered issue we should look at that in at least two different lenses. One is that mm, in the long run, when an industry starts moving towards openness, interoperability is something that has to happen organically, and we see that happening at the way that typically happens is, if you think of the value chain as a series of layers where every layer is creating more value eventually to the end customer. um, you have to keep thinking about how do you commoditize certain layers so that new innovation can happen in the layers above. And I'll just give a simple example. If you look at uh, how the internet itself worked early on, it was very much walled gardens built around the carriers and the telcos who took the basic infrastructure for the internet out to the user, and then interoperability happened across them. That was uh, interoperability in spectrum, interoperability in how you reduce pricing barriers and so on. And then you kind of created this relatively open internet. But on top of that, again, walled gardens started coming up at various points, and again, interoperability starts happening in new ways. Now, the key over here is that um, one lens of thinking about interoperability is that if if you if, as an industry evolves, you could start with walled gardens, but eventually you have to move innovation further up the value chain. And in order to increase innovation over there, increase the market over there, you then commoditize layers that are further below so that the rest of the industry can come in and join you. And so you deliberately commoditize and make interoperable what was not interoperable in the past. So one is that pure market forces can shift and move you towards interoperability. And this is happening especially in the healthcare industry, where if you look at electronic health records, they were never meant to be interoperable. When Obama first came out with it, he wanted it to shift power back to the user, but instead it shifted power away from the user, made them even more powerless because you couldn't move data between hospital systems, and the power shifted to the electronic health record providers. And what is happening today over the last 3 years with the implementation of the FHIR APIs, the Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources APIs, companies like Apple, Google, Amazon, they're all pushing for adoption of FHIR APIs because it frees up the data, moves it to an interoperable level, and allows them to create new business models on top. So just to close that first part of it, which is pre-regulation, even from an industry or a market forces perspective, interoperability aids innovation, and data remains non-interoperable only as long as the the players who seek to innovate in that market stand to lose because of the interoperability. So eventually, new players come in, or the same players reinvent themselves and make and commoditize the underlying layers. So that's one part. The second part of it is in terms of regulation. Now, typically regulation comes in to uh, comes in to attack data silos to the extent that those data silos create anti-competitive effects. And one of the examples of that is how reputation data works out in labor markets, where if you have invested, if you're a freelancer, for instance, in today's world, and you've invested in a particular marketplace and built a 5-star rating over there, or even if you're a host on Airbnb and you built a 5-star rating over there, your ability to move to other platforms is impeded because you won't get the same visibility and the same market power on other platforms. So what reputation data ends up doing is it locks you into certain specific positions. And what a regulator would have to do in this case is play out the balance between how do you open the data enough, how do you push for interoperability to the extent that more that the combined innovation in the market increases, which is that if there's one freelancing platforms, you can now have 15 freelancing platforms, and they all compete for and innovate. But at the same time, ensure that you do not open it up so much that the incentive to innovate goes away, because eventually the goal of regulation should not be to kill the market leader just because they're being anti-competitive. It should be to eventually lead to a fair and competitive market. So you need to ensure that you have that upper bound and lower bound on interoperability so that you prevent hoarding, but also do not come in the way of innovation. So that's where regulators should be operating.
I want to ask you a little bit more about this idea of reputation and what role that plays within data economics. I've read in something you wrote about a concept called a dual reputation system. I was wondering if you could explain a bit what that is and how it could potentially affect user agency.
Right. So the idea of a dual reputation system is one of the solutions to solving for the two thresholds that I just talked about, which is how do you ensure that there's interoperability that enables agency back to the user, but there's also uh, enough protection to the platform so that they are able to continue innovating. And the idea essentially is this, that every every reputation system involves two different kinds of uh, components. Is uh, one is more of a gatekeeping component, which determines whether somebody is good or not, whether somebody can be trusted or not. So that's very much gatekeeping. You either pass the bar or you do not pass the bar. The second is more of a skill component, where you determine how good somebody is at a particular thing. Now, the idea of a dual reputation system is that if you lock in the trust and the eligibility component, that prevents others from coming in, because the cost of determining that eligibility itself is so high, and that is all an upfront cost. If you could resolve that upfront cost, then you could enable innovation in the market, so that all market players that come in could innovate on a different lever of skill. And so one particular marketplace could focus on, say, a certain aspect of skill, and really find a new way to extract that value out of the work that is being exchanged. Another marketplace could look at another aspect of skill, and through that there would be differentiation and a much more competitive and healthy market. And the challenge right now is that the barrier to entry is high, largely because the cost of identifying bad actors itself is high, which should not be high. It should be something that can be shared and interoperable. And from a user agency perspective, this also plays out very well, because if you have a stamp of you have a one-time stamp of, here's somebody you can trust, and you can take that certificate and go and join multiple platforms, your the friction in joining those platforms becomes that much lower. You don't have to again go through the same processes, and that enables more agency back to the user, because they can participate across these multiple platforms. So that is fundamentally the idea of a dual reputation system. In terms of execution, it may be challenging, in the sense that a lot of the uh, a lot of um, the base layer of trust, and who's trustworthy, who should be allowed in, is open to interpretation based on jurisdiction, and open to implementation based on jurisdiction, whereas the skill level of the reputation is managed by a platform which could work across jurisdictions, could work internationally. So I really believe that if you want to execute a dual reputation system, you can't have a piecemeal approach to regulation, where the UK does its own regulation for it and Netherlands does its own thing. There has to be a way to do a more concerted regulatory approach towards that.
Yeah, I feel like that's always the challenge, is getting
Right.
the politics to work across borders the same way data does. I want to talk a little bit, something that you've talked about and written about a lot is this idea of moving from like a pipeline model to a platform model.
Right.
And I would love to use a company as an example for you to help flesh out some of the differences for me. And that company is Amazon. I feel like I've been talking to a lot of friends about the idea that Amazon seems like it's moving in this direction of owning like every level of the supply chain, with buying Whole Foods and then being able to do the delivery and all this stuff. And in some ways, to me, that strikes me as like old school vertical integration. Like, is this Standard Oil all over again, where you own every level of the supply chain and then you can just make boatloads of money? But I know that in many ways, Amazon also operates as kind of a modern day platform ecosystem. So I was wondering, how do you see Amazon as being different from an old school pipeline and vertical integration? And yeah, I was just wondering if you could explain that for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Amazon is such a fascinating example, because of all the companies that we're talking about, the one company that I believe truly embodies where business models are headed is Amazon. And there are multiple reasons for that. So let's think about what changes when you move from a pipeline to a platform. The first thing that changes, and let me first define the two. A pipeline, the way I define it, is a business model which is focused on the creation of a product, pushing it out, giving it to a consumer, and the consumer pays back for it. And most of our industrial business models were like that. Anything which was manufacturing, services, work in that pipeline model. And what a platform does is it understands its ecosystem and it connects them towards value creating interactions rather than pushing all the products itself. And it could do that in one of two ways. It could either understand the consumers really well by gaining access to their data, engaging them through a relationship, and use that understanding to then channel in the right third party producers to serve the consumers. Or it could go the other way and it could empower the producers so that they eventually serve the consumers. So think of Amazon Marketplace as I understand consumers, so come in and serve my consumers. Think of Shopify as I'm going to empower the producers so that they can then serve the consumers. So platforms, whether they empower the producers or they understand the consumers or do both actually, Open Table, for instance, is a great example of something that empowers the restaurants with booking software, but then also understands where consumers are booking and eating and so on. Irrespective of which of the two it does, or whether it does both, a platform in itself does not create all the value. It opens out that value creation. And when you think about Amazon, now Amazon is Amazon highlights one important thing, and that is that neither the pipeline model nor the platform model is a silver bullet. There's all pipelines are not going to move to platforms. Every part of a pipeline should not be a platform. In fact, there's a deeper economic argument into where pipelines should become platforms, and that essentially is that if you can benefit from external innovation, if you do not have all the solutions in house, you would want to open it up so that third parties can come in and participate. That's part of the pipeline and the platform model. Having done that, you need to ensure that A, you are opening at the right places because there is much more innovation happening outside. But B, you need to think about two other things. When you open, do you become too dependent on the external parties? If you do, then that threatens your business model. And secondly, even if you do not yeah, so if I just play off that first point, there are two solutions to that. You either uh, open up and eventually start backward integrating as a producer, so you become a producer in addition to the third parties, or you open up and you create your own different set of toll booths and control points to control these third parties. So I'll give two different examples. Netflix is a great example of I'm just going to go serve the consumer, and all of you movie studios can help me. And once it understood enough about what consumers were watching and what kind of movies were working, it backward integrated and became a producer itself because it was too dependent on these large movie studios. And the reason that's important is the YouTube versus the 15-year-old kid creating a movie. That power relationship is very different from Netflix versus Warner Brothers. And so it makes sense for Netflix to go back into production, but YouTube would not want to go back into production because it's much easier to just have that huge plethora of 15-year kids creating content. So that's one response, which may seem like a pipeline, but it's actually a strategic response to gain power in the value chain. The second response is what Amazon does. And well, Amazon does a part of the first response as well, because Amazon keeps tracking which products are selling in its marketplace, and then it goes into those categories, removes the merchants, and it sells its own products. And that's been proven by a range of research. And essentially, what Amazon is doing in that case is it's making the merchants invest the risk capital, but it's preventing them from benefiting from the justification of that risk capital. It's preventing them from gaining the upside. So in a way, it's getting risk-free upside across all these plans. So that's one way Amazon does that vertical integration. The second way, which you were alluding to more, I see that as ownership of critical control positions across the value chain so that nobody else has a way to move around you and give power to another player. Now, what that means in this case is if you look at Amazon's model, you would you have you have the e-commerce end pipeline, the end connect with the user, you have the warehousing, you have logistics, you have payments. These are all components where really large players could play an important role, like FedEx, UPS, MasterCard, and so on. But these are all components which, if you don't centralize, the experience can also become very fragmented. Now, the way this works out in Amazon's favor is because what what Amazon eventually the reason Amazon is successful is not that it has multiple merchants. Any other company like Walmart could also open up and have multiple merchants, but the reason Amazon is successful is because it has this growing base of Amazon Prime users who get 2-day free delivery. And creating that growing base is non-trivial, because for every Prime user you serve, you need to have a warehouse within 2 days of that user. And so creating that warehouse network, that gives Amazon non-replicable competitive advantage. And there's a mutually reinforcing effect that the more Prime users, the more money you have to invest back into the warehouse network, which then gives you even more Prime users. And so once you started that cycle, it becomes very difficult for somebody else to come in. So that, I believe, is the key reason why Amazon keeps investing in physical infrastructure. It's not so much to own the means of production as much as it is to own the infrastructure on which others will produce. And because you centralize that infrastructure, all uh, alternatives to that infrastructure would not work quite as well. So in that case, what you're doing is you're vertically integrating access to the end customer with access to the infrastructure, and squeezing everybody in between for the margins. Because as these two things scale, the margin shifts more towards both these sides, the gatekeeper to the market and the owner of the infrastructure. And I see Whole Foods also in the same model, where Amazon going into food or going into healthcare, Whole Foods could act as an infrastructure over there. So that's where I see Whole Foods as less of a stores play and more as a food supply chain as a service play eventually.
That's super interesting. And I feel like, judging from the chat, this idea is opening up a lot of thoughts. I do want to ask you one more question before I move on to kind of like politics and power, even though we've been touching on those issues. And that's kind of going back to what made you decide to research and write about platforms in the first place? And has your thinking on platforms changed at all since you first started researching them and came out with Platform Scale in 2015?
Yeah, so I started, I kind of didn't start thinking about this as platforms and platform economics. Back in 2006, I first started trying to create a framework of how the how value creation on the internet was fundamentally different from value creation in the traditional world. And at that time, a lot of the narrative was online versus offline, digital versus physical. And then the moment you saw a digital store do something physical, you would then say, well, digital has lost. And so there were very, very simplistic explanations for a lot of these things. And around that time, I was working on a bunch of things. I was working at Yahoo, working on deals in companies like Alibaba, and I could see the difference between Yahoo and Alibaba. They were two fundamentally different companies, and one saw the internet as a way to push the newspaper model at scale, and the other saw the internet as a way to enable a whole economy. And so I kind of started, putting together my thoughts on this around that time. And somewhere around 2009 or so, I condensed this into this idea of the world is moving towards platforms. And around 2012, started looking into it full time and started my research in partnership with MIT. And through that, the two books came out. And essentially, the key driver that kind of drove me towards it is, how is value creation fundamentally different? Is it as simple as physical versus digital, online versus offline? Today, we know it's not, but back in 2006, people saw the internet as just another channel. And it just did not ring true that the internet was just another channel. If it really was just another channel, why was Google winning and Yahoo losing? Was it just about search versus portal? So the thing is that people had very simplistic ways to resolve that question. And eventually it came down to this explanation that started explaining a lot of things that were happening on the internet. So that's why I doubled down on this. And around 2015, this started becoming really big on two or three different counts. traditional companies came out saying that platforms were the key investment focus for the next few years or the next decade and more. At the same time, the regulation of these large internet companies started as data factories and platforms, and their positioning as being different from, it's not just about creating a great customer experience and making the world a better place or whatever narrative they were playing. It's a much deeper story about creating a data factory that enables this large ecosystem of activity. So I think the books kind of came out at a time when this was just taking off, and so it kind of grew with that. And so that's been my story.
That's really interesting to hear. I do see some questions coming through Kiko chat. I think I'm going to keep going because I just want to make sure we hit these other topics, and I'll ask some of these at the end. Yeah. So moving on, I've heard you talk about this concept of data colonization. I was wondering what you mean by that and where and how you're seeing that phenomenon play out.
Right. The idea of data colonization is now widely spoken about by quite a few people. So if you look at this whole idea of surveillance capitalism, that is fundamentally the idea of data colonization. When I look at data colonization, as I kind of combine that with two other components, and that is that data colonization is most effective when you combine that with subsidized technology infrastructure that enables you to extract that data, and then you combine that with standards development that allows your technology infrastructure to be interoperable and plug into many other different contexts, and allows it to be used in many other different places. Now, while we understand Facebook and Amazon and some of these companies as data extractors and surveillance capitalism and all of that, data colonization becomes most interesting when countries do it. And the country that is doing it in the most interesting way is actually China. So if I just run through that very briefly, I did a year-long study on this in partnership with the Brookings Institution recently, which was published a few weeks back. China's future strategy is about creating a global digital infrastructure that can be exported to many different countries to fundamentally change the nature of payments and trade. And if you just think of those two things, they are that is where power lies in the global geopolitical order. If you change payments and trade, and there are two other elements, they also want to change urban infrastructure and supply chain infrastructure, but also national identity. But I'll come to that later. But China essentially, back in 2016, they created this thing called the Digital Silk Road, which is a component of the Great Belt and Road initiative. And the Digital Silk Road is a public-private partnership framework which calls for Chinese companies to work alongside the Great Belt, the Belt and Road Initiative, and export infrastructure out to other countries in the Belt and Road. So if you really look at what China has been doing, and again, as I mentioned, it's data colonization, it's coupled with free or subsidized digital infrastructure, which makes it sound benevolent, but then coupled also with standards development. So Alibaba, for instance, it started as an e-commerce company and started as creating this marketplaces. And over the last 4 years since this Digital Silk Road happened, they shifted direction to creating the Electronic World Trade Platform, which is fundamentally an infrastructure. Again, going back to the Amazon example, they did marketplaces, but they also did infrastructure because you can squeeze the players in between if you own both the top and the bottom. And Alibaba is trying to do something similar now. It's creating global infrastructure for trade. And what it does is it partners with countries, sets up a digital free trade zone in that particular country, a trade hub that educates small businesses, allows them to digitize, participate in global trade. And then it connects this digital free trade zone and free trade hub with another trade hub in China, where a lot of the demand for this country's supply is going to come from. And through that, so they've done that in Malaysia, they've done that in Rwanda, they've been in talks with Belgium. Through that, they're setting up digital free trade hubs and free trade zones across the world, connecting it back to China initially, but then eventually connecting all of them with each other. So that would then create a fundamental trade infrastructure across the world. If you combine that with Alibaba's growing logistics network, which has only accelerated with the pandemic, that then combines the free trade infrastructure with the logistics network that they have, so even more infrastructural elements. And China, for its own part, has been setting up judicial courts that would regulate um, uh, cross-border trade disputes that would happen on this trade infrastructure. So if you think of it, they're really thinking full stack across the public sector and private sector and creating this whole component. Now, where this ties in with data colonization is because you export free infrastructure, but in exchange for that, you need all the data to come back. You need the data to pass through these systems. And so all the intelligence sits centrally, and that intelligence can then be used to inform trade, and not just inform but influence trade. Just as the US has all through post World War II used the US dollar as a foreign policy tool, and its control over credit card networks like Visa and MasterCard. China is trying to do the same thing now. And so they're doing the same thing with payments, where Ant Financial has invested in the top payments companies in every country in South Asia, now Brazil, some African countries, in exchange for those companies moving their infrastructure to Alibaba Cloud. And the eventual goal being that if all the top payments companies in the top in all these countries are built on the same infrastructure, you don't need Swift anymore. You can work across, you can create your own interoperability network. And they're also working with banks to move them onto the cloud as well. So these are, again, a couple of examples where, again, the credit scoring algorithms, the risk or the fraud mitigation algorithms are all owned centrally by Ant, while the payments activity happens in the individual countries. So again, that's an example of data colonization. And um, Alibaba and Huawei's smart city projects, again, cities around the world are using that for the smart city brain. So that's another aspect where data colonization happens. National identity systems from China are being exported to different countries to enable contact tracing right now. That's again data colonization. So it's all one big strategy of free infrastructure coupled with global standards development enables data colonization and concentration of intelligence in one single place.
So I have a couple follow-up questions there.
Sure.
For sure. The idea of colonization is kind of fundamentally extractive. So first, I want to know, is data and identity the thing that's being extracted? And also, I would love to hear more about how China is exporting these national identity systems for contact tracing use.
Right. So the idea of colonization has been fundamentally extractive. If we go back to the first question that you asked today, what's special about data? You can extract and you can still leave the data, and you can gain new things out of it that were not possible in the past. So when you think about colonization traditionally, it was extraction, yes. It was almost exploitation, because once you extracted, there was very little less. So maybe very little left. So maybe what may not happen to the same extent today is we won't have exploitation, because data is a relatively recombinable resource compared to traditional labor and traditional gold and so on, which were extracted in colonization. But the other aspect of colonization and extraction was the power imbalance that it created between the colonizer and the colonized. I believe that will happen at an even bigger scale in the data economy, because if you can extract intelligence across 1,000 smart city implementations, even if the cities individually perform well. I'm not saying that the cities are going to be exploited and banks in individual countries are going to be exploited. So let's take out the exploitation narrative of colonization away. But the power imbalance is going to be way higher than it ever was in traditional colonization. And that is because you can have everybody in the ecosystem grow a little, but the player at the center of the ecosystem grows exponentially more. So while everybody benefits a little, there's still a power concentration that happens right there in the center. Going back to your question about contact tracing, well, the thing is that a lot of surveillance equipment was already being exported by China over the last couple of years. Venezuela, for instance, has this thing called the Fatherland card, which is modeled on, built by ZTE and other Chinese companies. And Zimbabwe has been, importing this infrastructure as well. A lot of the pre-COVID imports were about enabling authoritarian governments to scale their authoritarianism or do it more efficiently. Now there's a much more humanitarian need for that digital infrastructure. So it's China has done a great job of contact tracing, and that becomes a way to kind of export that out into the world. Now, for all we know, it could just end at that. But given the precedents that we have of surveillance technologies being exported, contact tracing technology would be a good Trojan horse to kind of move into the direction of surveillance technology eventually. That's what I would expect.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of people's fear, and I think there's good reason for it. I have two more questions I want to try to sneak in before we go into some of the Q&A. One is about the gig economy, and there's been talks about a concept of like data unionization potentially. And I've read that you proposed a kind of worker API as a way for workers to push back against platform control. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, and this has kind of happened in a few industries since I proposed, which is why it's now a little closer to reality. I first wrote about it around 2016, and since then, a few companies have started doing this in industries which are closer to digital goods and digital negotiation, if you will. And I'll take that example. But essentially, the idea is that traditionally, you you had the relationship between capital and labor, and that was mediated through unions. And the reason that worked was because capital and labor were both physically concentrated inside something called a factory. And so it was very easy for labor to have a voice with capital. Uh, what changes with platforms is you will see that platforms go out of their way to disempower workers in their ecosystem by not allowing them any form of collective action. Because one of the things that unseats a platform is collective action. It's difficult for a single bank to compete with Apple Pay, but if all banks in a country band together the way they did in Sweden, then they can go in and create something bigger than Apple Pay and then prevent Apple Pay from having that strong position in their country. So the same thing applies to a lot of these platforms and the relationship with users and producers or workers on in their ecosystem. And this is where, because platforms disempower these players by preventing any form of collective action, you need some mechanism for that collective action to happen. Today, the way collective action happens is, for example, Uber drivers, they meet on these third-party forums, and they exchange their tactics about how they've gamed the algorithm. But then Uber can also join in and see what people are doing and then change the algorithm in response. And it's much easier for Uber to centrally do that versus everyone to coordinate their actions against it. Which is why the idea is that if you really want to compete with an algorithm, you need to have an algorithm yourself. So the union cannot just be a body that is campaigning against these platforms. It has to be an algorithm, and it has to be an algorithm that creates evidence based on which negotiation can happen. And the idea essentially being this, that yes, it's great if everybody has their own personal data, but what do they do with it? Eventually, it should be the user's right to decide what they want to do with it, because for all it's worth, we are not privacy is not the only thing that we are optimizing towards in this world. We have to optimize towards security, we have to optimize towards wealth creation, we have to optimize towards access to goods and resources. And so the data that I have, while I need agency over it, I should also have mechanisms to exercise that agency, because just having a personal data wallet is not going to be enough. And that is the idea. Whether you have a union, whether you have another form of agency creation, it should be an algorithm, an API an algorithm that can take multiple data sources, use all of that to inform its negotiation versus somebody versus a larger entity. So if I take an example, there is a music label in the US, and I'm forgetting the name right now, but there's a music label which is essentially just an algorithm. It is a music label that works on behalf of musicians, and it works against large platforms where music is hosted, and it uses its technology to work on behalf of a musician, or it aggregates these musicians, works on behalf of them, and identifies opportunities where they can earn more money because their music has been used in a without appropriate royalties being passed back to them. And so that to me is real agency, not just owning your data because you have that data. You should have a way to translate ownership of that data towards economic power, the way these platforms have economic power. So I think while we talk a lot about personal data wallets, they are going to be, or while we also talk a lot about consent, a lot of it is not going to be useful unless the data that is coming back to us can be used for greater negotiation. So I think the bigger innovation opportunity that is there is for startups to come in and create personal data ecosystems, personal data negotiation tools. That is where once we start seeing that happen, then we'll see the personal data revolution.
Yeah, I feel like that's the idea with people getting their data back, a lot of it is fundamentally about power, and it's less about just like having the data, but ways, as you say, to negotiate power.
Right.
My last question, I might try to sneak a lot in here, is about the unintended consequences of giving data back to people. And I would love to kind of get to this idea of democracy and the fact that in many ways democracy is kind of based on collective action, which is voting. And I think there were a lot of promises in the early days of the internet that the internet was going to have this democratizing effect. It would democratize access to information with platforms. It democratizes production. And I'm wondering if at this point, have we seen platforms, even as they've created some kinds of democratization, also threaten democracy? So I'm wondering if you could talk about maybe some unintended consequences of giving data back to people and whether platforms have aided or threatened democracy.
Yeah, if I take your second question, I strongly believe that we cannot have true democracy while we have wealth inequality. It's just not possible because financial incentives work against collective action. And that has always been the case whenever new technology comes up. Even if you look at radio technology, initially, radio technology was a peer to peer technology. It was never supposed to be a broadcast technology. So we talk of the internet as the peer-to-peer economy, but this was happening back in the 1920s because radio technology, while it was being used to tinker around and while it was just these hobbyists playing around with radios, everybody had access to the bandwidth, everybody could create and interact, and all of that could work. And pretty soon, large corporations came in, centralized it, and took that access to the spectrum and the ability to use radio technology away from the peer-to-peer market. And it's just exactly the same thing that has happened with the internet. The original premise of the web was that this was this wide open place, anybody could publish, you were no longer editorially bound, did not have to go through gatekeepers. But eventually the way the internet is funded, or the way innovation in the internet is on the internet is funded, is a mechanism of wealth inequality. It's funded through venture capital, and venture capital wants outsized returns. If on the other hand it was funded as a a not for profit, it would have moved in a different direction potentially. But the fastest way, or so far the fastest way we've figured out to spur innovation, has been one that creates wealth inequality, because the incentives for innovation go away if you do not centralize that wealth with one or two, with a few players. And that's where all of Silicon Valley is operating right now. So the moment that starts happening, the moment you have financial power being concentrated because of venture capital and returns going back to a certain player, that leads to governance being concentrated, because in order to control the financial outcome of a large investment, you have to centrally control the ecosystem that you're creating. There's no way. All of this, talk about blockchain and crypto is great, but we still haven't found a credible way to scale some of those systems without requiring financing. And until we do that, we'll still be in this model where wealth inequality will keep on creating non-democratic systems. And I believe that is where we are with the internet. We have created systems out of a centralized way of funding, a centralized way of generating resources back to the founding team. And because of that, there has been a centralization of governance and ownership and control. and that prevents true democracy from happening, because you're now just creating new gatekeepers. Those gatekeepers have their own interests. They may want to have political clout, and so work in tandem with that. And so all of that starts playing a role. So I think that is my key belief, that while the internet, as long as it is just used as a tool, um, it can be, as long as it's just used as a tool, it can empower communities, it can enable communities. But the moment you start translating a power structure onto any technology, it that gets taken away from it, whether it's the radio or the internet. um, Going back to your, so that this was your second question. I forgot your first question in this
That's
process.
fine. I shouldn't have asked two questions at once. The other one was, what are some unintended consequences of
Right.
giving data back to people?
Right. I think there are a few different unintended consequences, and one which is one of these is that if you just um, think of it as consent versus not, you have to understand that um, you don't necessarily solve all societal problems by just giving data back to the people. You're now relying on people's varying levels of education. And we've already seen this happen with money, right? When money started exploding, or economy started growing, people in economies who had access to the money, there were new ways to influence that. There were new ways to influence them, and not everybody used money in the most economically beneficial way for themselves, because marketing functions developed. There were new ways to influence consumers, and so on. So my point is that while you shift power away from, it's no longer extractive, that's great, you shift power away back from them, from the big institutions to the consumers. But unless you solve the education problem of what do you do with all of this data, how do you use it to achieve your goals, you have the same issue that you have today with lack of financial literacy. People still don't achieve their goals. So that's one piece, which is, you may not call it unintended, but it's just something you have to think about, that people just aren't well equipped to understand what to do with their personal data. In fact, the people who are trying to solve this problem, people like you and me, and people, the 92 people on this call, are the most sophisticated when they think, when you think of people coming, thinking of data. These are not representative of the actual people who'll be getting the data back. So the first point is, how do we educate them? How do we work on their behalf? And that is where my second point about emergent unionization, or creating these agents that can work on behalf of the people, these algorithms uh, that can be created on top of these personal data wallets. That's the second piece that has to come in order to create value back for the people. The second thing is that sometimes regulating data can further enable greater concentration of power back with the player that's being regulated. And that this hasn't necessarily played out fully with the current data regulations. But what could happen, for instance, say with something like the GDPR, is that it could potentially prevent new startups from getting to scale, because consumers are more hesitant giving consent to their data to an unknown startup versus giving consent to a known startup or a bank or somebody they already know as a brand. And so to some extent, leaving the right of consent back to the consumer could make these companies even more powerful. Now, it's not a very sophisticated argument, but that's potentially one of the unintended consequences that could happen, and we should monitor for that when we do something like this. And the third thing is, as I mentioned, privacy is not the eventual goal of human existence. There are many other goals that we need to optimize for. So if we try to optimize data ownership and custodianship from a privacy only perspective, we'll end up creating suboptimal outcomes in on other parameters. And one good example of that is what's happening right now in the EU, where Facebook and others have said that if the regulations push through, they won't be able to counter child abuse. And so now that on the internet, and Facebook is one of the biggest arbiters of preventing child abuse in Europe. So if you think of that, it then brings us to this relatively ethical question: what is more important to protect? Should we protect against privacy loss or child abuse? Where should we optimize the trade-off? So I think those are the kinds of unintended consequences that we need to think about as well, because while we may solve one problem, we may end up creating a suboptimal solution, outcome for something else.
Yeah, I'm going to get into some of these questions people have been
Sure.
asking. One is the first one, which is going back to electronic health records. And this question says that the US approach to electronic health records has basically been, quote, increase the speed of the fax, the idea that it's information overload without interoperability. And the question is the private market ever able to lead, or should governments lead via universities and pre-market procurement?
In this case, okay, well, let me answer it as I interpret the question. So if we just think of it as should the private market lead versus should the government lead, I think it comes back to interests, whose interests are being protected. When we think of the private market, is it are we saying that it's largely players who are going to benefit from the current regime of closed systems? Are there any forces that are enabling the push towards open systems? If not, if you're in a scenario where that is not happening, the government has to lead. The government has to lead that, and that could work out in a longer cycle. But if, like healthcare, you're in a scenario where you have new players coming in and working to build the power structure and working with the government on that, the government has to play a careful balance over here, where it has to work in partnership with the private sector to drive openness, which is what it's doing with the FHIR APIs in the US. But at the same time, it has to ensure that the new players who benefit from interoperability do not create their own walled gardens or their own control points, because typically what the nature of technology is that if you open it out at one layer, you're going to move the control point to another layer. And so you're not really completely moving from closed to open ever. You're always moving to a new form of control. And so if you just take this, if I just take a simple example of this, people say that Apple is a closed iPhone model. Google is very open because anybody can use Android. What people don't realize is that while Android is a commodity, Google is closed because Google controls Google Maps that works as a complement to Android. So if you want to build a phone and you don't have maps, that phone is not going to be useful. But because Google controls the map, it then controls every handset manufacturer who builds an Android phone and forces them to follow the the Google guidelines. And so my point is that if you commoditize the hardware and the infrastructure, the control point shifts to the maps. And the same thing is going to happen in healthcare. You might end up creating interoperability at the layer of data, but where the data is actually going to be used. For example, if you create a research ecosystem, Apple is creating the search kit around its health record. You could shift control into the research ecosystem, where eventually, because you have the largest access to users who are engaged on their phone, you could create new kinds of control points around researchers accessing these users. So what's going to be important is when in situations like the US healthcare industry, where you're moving away from a current control model to a relatively open model, you should also think about where control is going to shift next and preemptively try to prevent that. And that's always going to be a back and forth cycle. But if regulators don't understand that regulation has to become systemic and cannot be reactive, if they don't understand that distinction, then they'll have to go on a series of reactions at every new layer where the control is created. So that is the key thing that they have to think through in such a scenario.
Yeah. Another question that has some upvotes is how would China view the My Data operator, where the individual has control and not the state? And I know you might not be as familiar with the My Data operator model, but I guess something that I know it's not exactly the same thing, but it would be interesting to get at here is the concept of identity interoperability within a national identity schema like China's. Do you see any world in which China would allow for people to take their data from their systems and use it somewhere else?
I think if it's just data portability and well, as long as you own the super system, it does not really matter how portable things are within it. So to the extent that people can take their data from one service to another, but all of that is fundamentally working on the same common standard at the back end, and China owns that standard, then you're just shifting it to a different layer. So I think one part of it is that as long as there's a way to exercise control behind the scenes without necessarily controlling your data, it's still control. It's at a different layer, but it's still control. So I would expect that at the end of the day, all technology PR is about telling the story at the right layer, because you'll see Google say don't be evil, and you'll see Facebook say well, make the world a better place, but they're talking about things they're doing at a certain layer and obfuscating something else that they're doing at a lower layer. And so the same thing can arguably be played out in any other scenario. You could work out things at the standards layer and say that data is portable as long as at the back end every system adopts this standard. And the reason every system adopts this standard is because it learns from the intelligence of every other system. And so you now shift the learning advantage away from the individual data layer to the standard at the back end. And so there are ways to go about that, uh, which is why I believe that some of these solutions can sound complete and yet be incomplete. And if I just give a simple example of this, if you think of how Google has dominated the browser market, a lot of people believe that browsers are open. Anybody can use a browser and it's completely open. And Microsoft used to have this enormous advantage, and Google came up with Chrome, which for the first time allowed not just websites but also apps to run on the browser, Chrome extensions. And so it fully embraced the idea of the cloud, whereas Microsoft was not able to move fast enough in that direction. Today, Chrome is 85% of the market. But what ends up happening because of that is not that Google controls Chrome. What ends up happening is that Google controls an engine below Chrome called the Chromium Engine. And the Chromium Engine is important because when developers build websites and applications, they want to test for just one specific browser, not for 15 different browsers. And if Chrome is 85%, they end up testing for the Chromium Engine, which is why if Internet Explorer has to run the same website or app well, it has to then move its browser to the Chromium Engine. So today, even though Google owns 85% of the market at the layer of Chrome, at the layer of the Chromium Engine, it probably owns 99% of the market. And what that then allows Google to do is Google can then come in and say, hey, I don't want YouTube to play well on a competing browser because I want it to play much better on Chrome. And that actually happens. And that shifts people away back to Chrome. So my point is that you could very well have data wallets at the Chrome layer, and then you could have a country come in at the layer below it and say, I'm going to specify a standard and work with it. I'm going to let you do whatever you want with data wallets and still have that control.
Right. And I know there are some people even in this group who have done a lot of who have focused on standards and building open standards and the idea of standards ownership. And it's really interesting and important. Another question here is, what are your thoughts on data/digital platform governance and how to avoid national initiatives to avoiding national initiatives becoming gatekeepers for basically preventing data being used to address global challenges?
On the first, the first question is fairly broad in terms of digital platform governance. There are different schools of thought on that. One is that platforms are self-governing systems, which is true. But you need to understand that platforms are self-governing systems to the extent that A, they can create an efficient market, and B, they can centralize value out of that market towards themselves. So in doing these two things, they may not always optimize for all players. And I take this example where the creation of an efficient market on Uber requires the driver not to know where the destination is, because if the driver keeps on canceling it because the destination is too far, then the passenger will not have a good experience. And so for the consumer to have a good experience, the driver has to suffer. And that happens on all platforms. There's always, with the self-governance model, there's always going to be optimal market outcomes, optimal value capture outcomes at the cost of optimal outcomes for every single player. And so that then brings in the need for extra platform governance, some other form of governance structure, which is beyond the platform. Largely in today's world, it is regulators and countries, but it could also be other forms of collective action that consumers and ecosystem players do. It could be industry associations and so on. So you need some form of extra platform governance to ensure that these kinds of elements are not gaining precedence. You're not having one player being exploited to create a good market. You're not having exploitation or extraction of data beyond what is needed to create an efficient market, and so on. So that's I would say that's my broad view on platform governance. Self-regulation will or self-governance will take you only so far. You need extra platform governance post that. Going back to the idea of how to think about national systems, I think we are at a point where countries are realizing that they need to play uh, an increasingly important role in this whole platform economy, and they're taking different approaches towards it. Some are just looking at it from a tax perspective because that's the fastest to get more money. Some are looking at it more long term. If you think of India building out the India stack, that's an approach of having a country build out a public infrastructure on top of which new platforms can be enabled. um, the key thing over here is that you need to watch out for the same thing that has always happened with technology. Technology always mirrors the power relations of the stakeholders involved. And so we need to be careful. Is it an authoritarian government doing this? Is it a government that wants to centralize gains towards a few private players, and is that getting embedded into some of the workings of this infrastructure? So I think those are the kinds of factors we need to play with, and we need to think through when we go when we go down this path of countries building new infrastructure for the platform economy.
Another question is, do you think that there will be personal data licensing platforms, and how would they work?
I would expect that eventually we would want to get towards personal data licensing platforms where I would expect that the personal data ecosystem needs to have multiple layers of value creation. So there's the personal data ownership, or the who's the custodian of that personal data, but then you need to go beyond that and see who's going to um, convert this personal data into some form of power for the owner of the data, into some form of value for them, which is where that whole negotiation ecosystem and value creating ecosystem comes in that I talked about. And in order for that to happen, you'll end up creating a market of personal data licensing, because I might have personal data and I may want to use it for a whole range of different mechanisms, just like I would use my wallet, which has my money, and I use it in 10 different industries over the course of my day. I would want to use my personal data also in 10 different contexts. And so that would lead to the creation of a data licensing ecosystem where you're able to convert data into insights, into value and negotiation power back for the user. And that whole data value chain across those three steps, for instance, will end up creating a data licensing ecosystem. So I absolutely see that happening if we move towards a personal data regime.
There's one last question here. It's about the idea of trust transaction costs. So apparently there's someone named Munger, who I don't know who they are. Munger talks about platforms reducing the triangulation, transfer, and trust transfer costs. When platforms like Amazon get to size and scope that they are, do they effectively raise the trust transaction cost?
Well, so the question is, who are we? Who's the stakeholder, or what is the purpose towards which we are looking, or towards which we are optimizing our cost function? So let me give an example of that. The way traditional transaction costs worked, and the way the reason we had vertically integrated companies was that we were focused on building or producing things at scale, and doing that in a cost-effective manner. And in order to do that, we had to internalize production functions, because the cost of operating that across industry boundaries would have been too or across firm boundaries would have been too expensive. And what digital technologies ended up doing was a range of digital technologies reduced the transaction costs, made companies more modular in the sense that you did not have to integrate across 4 or 5 different things. You could just do one thing and connect with the rest through APIs and through other forms of digital coordination. And that fluidity enabled the rise of platforms, because when you had to internalize these functions, you had to work vertically. Once you started breaking down platforms, what they do is they organize all of this horizontally. So if you think of vertical structures breaking down and every single function becoming a component in itself. So take the financial services industry as an example. A bank is a fully bundled, vertically integrated model. But today, Stripe can just do payments. Another company, say Plate, can just do banking data. So every company can take one single specific thing and do it really well because it can integrate with others for various other things. But for consumers and even for industry-wide coordination, the costs can increase if things become too modular. So what platforms do is they reorganize this highly modular industry structure by, say, instead of the bank being a bundle today, something like Square is a new bundle where Square reorganizes multiple different things from payments to loans, all of that in the context of one single service to the end consumer. So if you think of platforms, at the first thing that they do is they reduce transaction costs, or they organize the industry structure that has developed as a result of reduced transaction costs. Because transaction costs first go down, firms break up. When they break up, coordination again becomes expensive, and so platforms bring that down as well. What eventually ends up happening is that platforms can start taking platforms can start benefiting from various forms of internalization of market efficiency. So if I give a few different examples, a platform that controls a reputation system is able to determine which kinds of market transactions are going to be worth getting into versus not. And for that kind of a guarantee, it could take a higher cut, maybe not necessarily from the end consumer, but from other players in the market. And so eventually, platforms can start seeking rent. I don't know if I would necessarily say that they increase transaction costs in the way that you know um, in the way that organically transaction costs used to be higher in the past. But rather than talking about increasing transaction costs, I would say that platforms, by virtue of their position of organizing this large wide spanning ecosystem and organizing how consumers and producers make decisions over there, they can start extracting greater rents as long as they're able to empower better decisions. So that certainly happens. And eventually, as if you go back to the original component, the original idea that I mentioned, what platforms are doing, and Amazon was a great example, is they are taking ownership closer to the consumer, which is managing trust over there. And they're taking ownership of infrastructure and standards at the back end so that everybody's building on top of that. So the other thing that happens with platforms is once you start building your business on top of this infrastructure, you're locked in. And once you're locked in, that increases additional forms of costs on you in terms of compliance costs, in terms of restrictions that they can pose on you. So if you think of the rent-seeking ability at the top and the lock-in at the bottom, platforms do increase costs in those aspects.
I think we're just about out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up there. Sangeet Paul Choudary, this has been a very informative, and hopefully it's felt like a cozy fireside chat for all of you. Thanks for coming and talking to us. And yeah, it was great to see everybody here.
Great. Thank you so much, Molly. Real pleasure.
And I also want to thank Molly Schwartz for the great question, Sangeet Paul Choudary for the super interesting answers. And you audience, if you think that you know somebody who should understand more about the digital Silk Road, please do share the video recording of this session afterwards. I did share with you in the chat the discount code for the masterclasses. Please pick it up from there or send us a message afterwards. It would be great if you share your highlights of this session in Kiko afterwards. And the last point I want to make, please remember to visit some of our lounges today. For example, we have the demo lounge or partner lounges. And most importantly, do not skip the social program, because today we will have speech karaoke. So this is something very different. And also tomorrow, perhaps the highlight of the whole conference, open space, where you will create your own content. We saw so many questions here. People are really busily thinking. So please come tomorrow to the open space and share all your ideas also there. So thank you so much. Have a great evening, Sangeet in Singapore. And you, Molly, have a great day in New York, because you're only starting now. We are off now. Thank you.
Thank you.